have him back. So thanks a bunch, Steve.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That's a nice introduction, and I see some familiar faces in the list here. It's not that long ago that I was working alongside Sarah at the Program Center, and it's nice to see the familiar folks and really a pleasure to get to know the rest of you as well. As Sarah said, this is my full-time job. I provide risk management consulting services uniquely for the outdoor industry, and I work with organizations like the Mountaineers to help them improve their risk management and safety efforts, not just physical safety, but emotional safety and organizational risk management as well. So this talk we're doing tonight is kind of right up my alley, and I find this to be a really personally fascinating topic and a really relevant one for all those things I mentioned. So I hope you settle in. I know it's been kind of a tough year, 2020, and a really stressful couple of weeks, and I'm really hoping that we can relax, settle into this intellectual stuff tonight, give ourselves a little escape, and maybe have some interesting and enjoyable new ways of looking at things and learning from each other and learning about this interesting topic. So thanks again for making time to be here with me tonight. If you'd like to turn your as Sarah said, if you'd like to turn your cameras on, I think it just creates a little bit more of a sense of people in the room. And if bandwidth is an issue or for any reason you prefer not to, then that's absolutely up to you. So tonight we're going to be talking about learning from near misses. And it's one of my personal favorite topics. And we're going to start with what I think is a useful quote to frame this entire topic. And this is from Sarah Carpenter, and I'll give you a chance to read that. While Sarah works in the avalanche industry, and this quote is specifically about snow and avalanches, I think it's really easy to replace that with sea kayaking, with mountaineering, with rock climbing, with trail running, with many of the activities, the outdoor recreation and education activities that you all are a part of. And Sarah's point here is wonderful. It's a wicked learning environment, and we don't get feedback every time we go out. So why not? We're going to dig into that and try to turn that around and see what we can do better as a result. I was going to play you a YouTube video to get things started, but YouTube had a worldwide outage just about an hour ago, and it's kind of spotty right now, so I'm not going to subject you to that. Maybe I'll send the video on as like homework after the session. So here we go. Sorry, having a little issue here. Here we go. So what we're going to start with here tonight is just some definitions to make sure we're defining terms the same way. And Sarah's going to launch a poll here in a second, but what I'd like to do is ask you, as your Jamboard said, when we were first kind of rolling into the room, several of you mentioned that you had some close calls of your own. And I'd like to start by asking you to think about those and reflect. Did you and your partners actively debrief and discuss those after the near miss? Did you share it more broadly with anyone else afterwards? And did you have any anxiety thinking about that, sharing of that, being vulnerable and sharing that with others? So if there's a poll launchable, that would be great. Let's have everybody please just give some brief answers to these poll questions.
We've got answers coming in.
Answers are rolling in, I see.
Steve, you want me to go ahead and end and then share these?
Yeah, let's go ahead and end and share, please. Okay, folks, you should be able to see the answers here. And you can, I think you can scroll down if there's too much on the screen for you to be able to see. But now this is interesting. Looks like 67% of you, when you did have a near miss, you did debrief it afterwards, but some people did and weren't exactly sure what they were pulling out of that debrief. And in some cases, 12% didn't talk about it. Pretty common. Did you share it with anyone else? This is kind of mixed, mostly yes, some no. And certainly for those who did share, there was some level of anxiety that people felt, or they didn't share it at all. So these guiding questions here are kind of the heart of much of what we're going to talk about tonight, or some of the factors that go into, debriefing, learning, the barriers that exist to sharing that stuff and really pulling the most out of it. And the things that we do personally and societally and maybe organizationally that can create anxiety around sharing this kind of stuff. So thanks for that. I think we can just close that poll out. Yep. You might have to click on your own screen to close it out. Thanks for that. So let's keep moving along here. So we're going to define some terms because we're going to be talking a lot about near misses tonight. And I think it's important for us to get on the same page about what that really means. So what a near miss is and what it isn't. It is a miss. It is not a hit. I often see people, use near miss pretty broadly. No one died, so it was a near miss. And it's, the way that we're defining it and talking about it tonight, it's literally a near collision, a near miss, almost an incident, but not exactly. Also, I think it's important to say that there's lots of things. We could spend our whole day just reporting near misses, right? But relevant ones, the ones that are probably really worth tuning into and spending time on, are ones that stand out from normal. Normal, of course, varies from one person to the next. I think it's important for your team, for your group, for your branch, for your organization to really have some clarity around what is normal. If you're hiking in the forest and a tree falls 1 foot away from you and almost hits you, that's probably not normal. But if a tree falls all the way on the other side of the valley and you hear it and it's not really near you, could that be normal, for your organization, for your norms and for your risk tolerance? Let's look at what OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, says. So OSHA has a great definition of a near miss, and they call it, you can read the definition here, no one is harmed, but injury could have occurred if there was a slight difference in timing or location. So a tree falls right next to a tent, near miss. A tree falls and hits that tent, especially with people in it, that would not be a near miss, that would be an incident. So OSHA also calls near misses a close call, a near collision, or I like this one, an accident precursor, with the theory that if we aren't paying attention to near misses and if we aren't tuning into those things, then we might be missing a signal that there's bigger issues going on, and these could be precursors that occur before an accident that give us a clue to tune in. As evidenced by this wonderful cartoon, here's a worker, with his steel-toed boots and his hard hat, and he's happily, just saying to himself, oh, woo, it was just a near miss, without figuring out what's causing these boxes to fall from the ceiling to begin with. What do I need to maybe be doing differently in this situation? So it's a widely misused term. I often see trip reports online or stories where people will say, I fell 40 feet into a crevasse and I broke my leg and they helicoptered me out, but I was rescued and I was really fortunate to survive this near miss. And to me, that is not a near miss. That is a broken leg helicopter rescue. That is an incident, not a near miss. So just really want to be clear with our terminology here tonight as we're talking about this stuff. Also, to be fair, a physical near miss can still be an emotional hit. There was an entire talk this year at the Wilderness Risk Management Conference about near miss trauma, and the the emotional impact that a close call can have on an individual or on a group, even if there are no physical injuries that take place. So that's a key, nuance that I wanted to share. Here's some examples of questions, and you could certainly come up with your own, for your branch or for your organization. I'll give you a moment to read through these, and I would ask you to think, is this an incident that you would report? Is it a near miss that you would report? Or is this just normal? Is this just business as usual? So I'll give you a moment just to gaze at this and think about it. I would share my thoughts on these, which is to say, obvious incident would be a student gets a cut using their own pocket knife. That's not a near miss, that's a hit, that's an actual injury. That's an incident, not a near miss. The van with the students slamming on the brakes to avoid hitting a dog, no one is injured. They were wearing seatbelts, they weren't speeding, they were using the vehicle as it was intended to be used. I suppose you could argue that it was a near miss, but on the other hand, you could argue that this might just be equipment working as intended, in the same way that someone slips at the top of a top rope climb and is caught by their belayer, and equipment works as intended. Some of the other ones to me are obvious near misses. The student almost eating the peanut cookie, the tree narrowly missing the group, no one getting injured, a rattlesnake just a few feet away. If I'm within 10 feet of a rattlesnake, I'm pretty anxious about that. So, to me, those are more obvious near misses. The instructor disagreement at the bottom, I guess it would kind of depend on the organization and how you think about that. But, to me, that might just be part of the job of leading a trip with youth and expecting people to be homesick. And maybe you and your co-instructor are working out some sort of a leadership style group dynamics, but it's not, to me, an incident. It might just be considered part of your job. So these are just useful, examples, trying to bring this to light a little bit more. And the reason I'm focusing on this is it's a widely misused term. And by having specific examples like this, I think it can help you define not just what an incident is and not just what a near miss is, but what's normal, what's considered just business as usual, something within the scope of your job or your volunteer leadership role that you play. So those may or may not be perfect examples, for your activity, your branch, what you do, but the idea of defining normal, near miss and reportable, I think, is a useful exercise. So zooming back out, we're going to now move from definitions. We're going to talk about psychology and some of the various factors that go into near-miss reporting and what makes it harder or easier to learn. So why are near misses underreported? There is another Jamboard activity we're going to invite you to do, and Sarah can drop the link to that Jamboard into the chat. And it would be wonderful if everyone would click into there and contribute to that discussion. And I'm going to move over and share that Jamboard on my screen.
Steve, while you're doing that, there was a question in the chat that says, is there a gray area where the injury was minor, like a bruise or a scrape? I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that, or you might be covering it later.
I would still call that an incident, not a near miss. I wouldn't call it a miss if there's an injury, but there are gradients of injuries, right? And many organizations will have like green, yellow, red, or level 1, 2, or 3, or injuries that are classified minor, major, critical, something like that. So to me, if there's blood, if the first aid kit comes out, if there's an injury, no matter how minor, then to me that's no longer a near miss. That's neatly an incident or an injury instead.
Steve, I probably missed this, but what's your background in the outdoors? Are you an alpine climber?
I was more of an alpine climber when I was younger, but I've climbed quite a bit. Now I do a lot more sea kayaking, hiking, a little wildlife photography. I used to climb ice, whitewater paddle, so pretty widely ranging.
So on some of those trips though, weren't you seeing like a near miss every like minute? If you're doing an alpine climb through the pickets or something?
Yeah, and that's great question. Thanks for clarifying that. So that's where, I came back at the very beginning to saying that a relevant near miss, one that really had the potential to be something you can learn from it, something you might want to do differently. Certainly, like if you're going through an ice fall and the whole thing is a near miss, right? you're exposed to objective hazard the whole time. And so, that's why I think that exercise I just showed, where you're really trying to norm what's normal, what's useful to focus on and learn from, and what's actually an injury, an incident, a wrecked vehicle, whatever it might be. So your question is really astute because it invites norming that. And I think what's normal for an alpine climber might not be normal for a hiker, or what's normal for a sea kayaker with weather and wind might not be normal for someone who is having a day at the beach with their kids. So I really think it is a great nuanced question, and norming that with your group, with your organization, with your team, so that you have a shared definition is an important piece. Because yes, I mean, the goal of this is not like filling your spreadsheet full of irrelevant normal things. It's actually tuning into the signals where we have an opportunity to learn something useful. Does that address your question?
It helps a lot, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great question. So people are popping some great answers into this Jamboard right now. Some of the reasons why near misses are generally underreported. So let's take a look at some of these answers here. Risk versus reward. People feeling like, reporting a near miss isn't worth the risk they're taking socially, or the time that they have to spend, or some kind of risk on their part. They perceived risk of like raising their hand and bringing it up. No one was injured, so why focus on that? What's the big deal? Maybe I didn't even know it was a near miss. Nothing bad happened. Maybe it was a high risk activity, kind of getting to Ty's point a little bit, I think. Embarrassment, that's a really good one. Reporting near misses is not mandated. Also the energy and the time that it takes. Report it to who? No real incentives to report. A history of accidents can be harmful to the reporter and can affect their reputation. Great insights. You forget about it after it happens. Fear, seeing something that can be seen as a black mark against your leadership, right? Unaware that it was a near miss. These are some really good themes. You folks are nailing some of the human factors that go into this that make it hard. A lot of what we seem to be calling here as near misses is interpreted as business as usual. Near misses may involve poor judgment and can be embarrassing. So one might be reluctant to share the event as it reflects poorly on the person involved. These are really great insights, and thank you for sharing all these. I'm going to go back into the presentation. And I'm going to share a couple of my answers to this question, and it mirrors some of the things that you folks came up with. So it is human nature to want to avoid that discomfort. And when that rock goes right by your group, when you're climbing up that couloir and everyone has that, oh my God moment, and you move on, there's a human nature to want to avoid the discomfort of really talking through some of that stuff and revisiting it. There's often perceived hierarchies. Like if you're not the leader of that expedition, you might not see it as your place, to bring up those concerns. Famous plane crashes have occurred where everyone in the cockpit knew that the plane was launching on an active runway where other planes were landing. but no one wanted to be the one to speak up and say that to the captain, who proceeded undaunted right into a mid-air collision or running out of fuel, or lots of examples where, you know, hierarchy can make it hard to be the one that wants to be the one to speak up. And some of your answers echoed that. There may be no clear process for reporting near misses, or a really laborious, tedious, time-consuming process that serves as a barrier. So that sometimes we see that. There is anxiety or embarrassment, or many of the things that you folks mentioned. It might reflect badly on your leadership if this thing had occurred and it was perceived as your fault. You might not see what's in it for me. You know, why should I talk about this? And fear of some kind of consequences to you. Yeah, something that might reflect badly on you. So these are many of the common, like, human factors or the psychology that makes talking about near misses hard. There are some of the same things that make talking about like a broken leg or a critical injury hard, but it's not as easy to hide those. You know, it's not as easy to pretend that those didn't happen. So we tend to, on some level, you know, hit those big events, but it's much harder for us to tune into and pay attention and break through these barriers to tune into the near miss, the smaller things. And I'm suggesting that we have a lot that we can learn from the smaller things. And we'll talk more about that. So I have a cautionary tale here for you, or an example. Another one from the avalanche industry that's been great at, pretty great actually, about talking about near miss stuff. So a skier triggered an avalanche on a low hazard day, and he felt like, well, that's unusual. I have a responsibility to report this so others can learn, because this was a weird anomaly. And he sent in the avalanche report to his local avalanche center. This is not the Northwest Avalanche Center. This was actually up in the Tetons. And he had this sense of making himself vulnerable to judgment. He had that all too familiar twist in his gut when he started second guessing something that he posted on social media, just feeling anxiety about it. And he stated that the way people perceive misconduct is an interesting word, misconduct in the backcountry, can lead to a hushed atmosphere, sort of a suppression of willingness to talk about and explore this stuff. So the story continues. He wondered if he'd be ridiculed for not knowing the exact details of the line he was skiing, or getting something wrong in his terminology. He thought maybe he wasn't skiing something hard enough, and that was embarrassing. He thought maybe he was exposing some secret by including the name of this stash, you know, that he had skied. And he thought maybe he was simply overreacting altogether. The same way that Elise had thought twice about pulling her airbag at the Tunnel Creek avalanche back in 2012 near Leavenworth. Fear of being teased and being frightened by what she at first considered a small slough, which of course was a big avalanche that ended up killing multiple people. So this is a great article called Getting Beyond the Emotional Game of Reporting an Avalanche. And we'll send that as like a follow-up homework for you folks if you want to find it and read that article. But it's quite good. And I think it captures much of what we're going to be talking about here tonight. So those are some of the barriers. Those are some of the things that make it hard. And I will say the flip side of that coin, and where we're going, is that when we break through those barriers and we start talking about our near misses and those close calls, you are harvesting information that would otherwise go completely unexamined. We have a lot more near misses and close calls and learning opportunities than we have broken legs, car wrecks, you know, critical incidents. We have a lot more of these that we can learn from if we harvest them. Larry Goldie, a ski guide over in the North Cascades, he likes to say that near misses are lottery tickets that we've already paid for, so we may as well cash them in. And we can help other people learn from our experience, so that we don't, as human beings, we don't all need to repeat the same mistakes every time. You know, we can benefit from each other's experiences. So these two images are examples where I had a close call of my own, near miss of my own. And this is me having survived a pretty scary fall into the waterfall hole that forms every year up at Asgard Pass. About 20 years ago, I glissaded into that hole that you see there and almost died in there, but managed to tunnel my way out and had a remarkable close call in that icy subterranean place. And as a result of me writing a blog about it and sharing it through the Mountaineers website, there is now a sign up at Asgard Pass at the trailhead, this sign that points out some of these hazards. And I was able to, work with the Leavenworth Mountain Association and advise the U.S. Forest Service on some of the language in this picture here for that sign. And so it's just an example of, we don't all need to glissade into the same moat, and we have an opportunity to share these stories and learn from each other's near misses. When I did share that story, I got a lot of praise and a lot of thanks for it. And I also got some judgment and some people that were like, how in the world could the Mountaineers have hired a guy like this to work as our, in our education department when he has such bad judgment and has such, obviously such an unsafe person in the mountains. So, it is not easy to be vulnerable and to share these kinds of stories, but I think in the end, the benefits of sharing them greatly outweigh the downside if we can battle through, some of these issues that make it daunting or scary to do that. So we're going to dive into a little bit of an academic section here that I hope resonates with you, and I hope you enjoy. Those of you who have seen a version of this presentation before, much of this is new to the talk, so I hope you enjoy it. This is relevant. We need to talk about what causes accidents. And there are some really common theories around this that make it easier to judge and to blame and to make those barriers bigger. And there's other theories that we'll get to that I think really are more useful ones that might help make near-miss reporting and near-miss learning easier. So we're going to look at the 3 different categories that you see here, kind of a linear model of accident causation, more of a complex model, and ultimately a systems way of thinking about accidents. So way back in the 1930s, a researcher and an author by the name of Heinrich wrote a book, and he was actually working for an insurance company at the time, and he'd been asked to analyze all of these claims that had come into the insurance industry, millions of claims that he looked through the data. And he did a very in-depth look at this pool of data that he had. And he came up with several theories back in the 30s that continue to very heavily inform and influence the way that a lot of people talk about and think about and analyze accidents, even today. And I will say that some of his methodology was quite flawed, and there are some issues with his approach, but just we'll explore this and we'll see what resonates with you. So in looking at his data, what he found is a graph that looks a lot like this, and that there are a lot of unsafe acts and conditions that occur. There is a fair amount of near misses that occur, a smaller number of minor injuries, a smaller number of severe injuries, and an even smaller number of fatalities. And he did not intend for the triangle, as they call it, the safety triangle, to imply that there was a causal relationship between these different things necessarily, or a linear relationship. But the way that the graphic is set up, it kind of implies, it implies that if we can just eliminate all those unsafe acts and all those near misses, then there will never be any more fatalities. Research has subsequently showed that that is just not true. And it really depends on the industry that you're working in and the environment and the situation. But the useful part of the graph, I think, and the one that I think we should tune into, is how many near misses occur, how many happen, and what a big opportunity we have to harvest useful information from those, but only if we talk about them and only if we battle through some of those barriers that we mentioned. So there's a closer look at that safety triangle, as they called it. There's another piece that he introduced that was he called it the domino theory, and you all know it. It's how one domino leads to the next, and how eventually those dominoes fall in a way that creates an accident. You know, in Heinrich's case, he thought those dominoes were things like hazardous conditions, human errors, what type of equipment were people using, things like that. And the theory was that this was a very linear model of accident causation. If we could just find the broken piece in the system, if we could just find the one thing that's going wrong and fix it, then that accident won't happen again. And often the closer you are to the accident itself, the more likely you are the thing that will get blamed. And that is the human being to whom the accident occurred. So the problem with the safety triangle and the problem with the domino effect is really these were tools for the managers who are writing the incident reports to begin with to blame the workers for these incidents happening. And furthermore, it was a way for the insurance company to demand higher and higher rates and different things from the people that they were insuring. So all of this was sort of a large scale study that had some different purposes than the way that the study has been applied. The main thing I want you to take away from this is that Heinrich rightly pointed out that there's a lot of near misses and that there's a lot of factors that can cause accidents, but he had this very linear way of thinking about it that tended to like find the one piece that was broken, blame that person usually, and try to fix it. So, there's the classic, we can just stop the dominoes from falling and then, we will be safe again. So that's a very linear model of accident causation. We're going to look at a more complex model. I hope you guys are staying with me here. This came we're all the way up into the 1980s now. And James Reason wrote a book called Managing the Risks of Organizational Accidents. It is a very dry book. I do not recommend that you read it. All you really need to know is this right here. And I think this is pretty interesting. And some of you may have seen this before. This is the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. And here, we have the idea, it's again a linear model, but it's slightly different than the dominoes, where there's a hazard. And in order for that hazard to penetrate all the way through these layers of defense and turn into an injury, it has to make it through holes that exist in the layers of Swiss cheese, like the Swiss cheese being things like your training, your procedures, your supervision, your equipment, what's in your first aid kit, your trip design, your emergency response plan, all those different layers. And those holes really need to line up for that hazard to be able to penetrate all the way through and become an injury. So this is useful because now we're starting to get away simply from like blaming the person closest to the accident. And we're starting to look at some of those other organizational factors that go into an accident occurring. But in the end, it is still a very linear kind of way of thinking about it, where we can just fix this one component, we can fix that one piece, keep these holes from lining up, and we'll be good. And that is, still in many ways arising from Heinrich's original way of thinking about this stuff. So, there's the Swiss cheese model, kind of a fun, interesting model, but it leads us to more of a current way of thinking about this stuff. And this systems thinking is attributed to many authors. It says that accidents are not linear and they can't be prevented by linear thinking like this Swiss cheese model. So the Swiss cheese model goes away, and what it's replaced by is something that looks more like this kind of Swiss cheese. Accidents don't simply arise in this linear, predictable, or uniform, deterministic way. Rather, it is the interactions between the Swiss cheeses themselves. And it is things that come up as new risks as we go through the activity that weren't there to begin with. So it's just much more unpredictable, a little more scary in some ways, but much more accurate and realistic portrayal of, if you break down an accident afterwards, it is not linear, it's not predictable. We don't see it coming. If we did, we'd stop it. So in this way of thinking, near misses are weak signals that we can learn from. And the difference between a tragedy and a normal event is actually very slim because of the unpredictability and the dynamic nature of how accidents actually occur. So, in our case, whether you're a sea kayaker, mountaineer, rock climber, whatever activity it is that you're doing outdoors, I would ask, what are some of the complex variables what are these layers of Swiss cheese? Think for a moment, just jot down for yourself or pop into the chat if you like. What are some of those different factors that create complex variables in the environments in which you are doing your activity? I'll give you a moment to jot down a few things. For me, I'm thinking about stuff like weather, how changeable and dynamic that is. It's not the same, from the time you start the trip to the end. Other complex variables are things like the human factors, the different personality types of the group and the dynamics between those people, the different kinds of equipment that you might be using, and maybe different people, different kinds of belay devices on the same climb. So many variables, and it's not that any one of those things alone is good or bad, it's the interrelationship between them. Like someone who is tired running down a steep slope carrying an ice axe. It's not like you can't do any of those three things by themselves, but it's when they combine together, now you've got someone who is tired and disoriented running down a steep slope with an ice axe, and it's the combination of those things together that can create the potential for an accident that wasn't there before. So again, without getting too hung up on the theories, my main point here is that, near misses can, in this complex system that you're seeing, a near miss is something that can be a weak signal that you can ignore, or something that you can tune into and say, what am I missing here? What's my blind spot? What's something that could easily happen again if I don't figure out what's going on in this complex system that is the reality of how our climbs and our paddles and our trips actually occur in real life. And I love this quote. First of all, again, backing up, the difference between a tragedy and a normal event can be very slim. The way that the ping pong ball bounces around in these, in this complex way, can happen 99 times in a positive way and one time go wrong. And Sidney Decker, who is one of my personal heroes in the risk management and safety world, he's an author from Australia, he writes that death does not arise from sudden failure, it hides in success. How many times do we have a trip that has all the ingredients and the potential and the opportunities for a tragedy to occur, and it doesn't occur, and we can chalk that up as a successful trip, and that we did everything right and that we were safe. And Sydney reminds us that, death doesn't arise from some sudden single point of failure. It is there in a latent way all along, and it hides in our successes. And we need to look for it. We need to find those opportunities for failure. And near misses are a great low-hanging fruit to provide us with that opportunity. Okay, so I know another example of death not arising from sudden failure, but hiding in success. I'm sure many of you recognize this picture. It is the British petroleum oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico that spectacularly exploded, killing 17 people, killing 11 people, injuring 17 more. and creating an environmental catastrophe of enormous significance. But for 7 years preceding that explosion, they had a perfect safety record, 0 incidents, nothing reported. They won all kinds of safety awards. Is it because they were safe? Were they focusing on the right things? Were they really running this perfect operation? And what were the weak signals? What were the opportunities they had to learn? What were the chances they had, to harvest something that could have possibly prevented this from occurring? And I love that story, because it just shows that, we can focus on the wrong things. I see some chats coming in, so I'm going to just take a quick peek here. Yeah, Julianne says it bothers her that real action and change usually only happens after a tragedy or repeated tragedies. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So that's a great observation. Let's see, earlier, someone asked, I'm just going to see if there's some questions here I can address. Could you state again what research had found about the relationship between near misses and fatalities? Is it that you can't eliminate fatalities by eliminating near misses, or is there no correlation? I would say that there is the triangle, as I showed it. It implies a correlation, and it implies that all we need to do is clean up the bottom of the pyramid. If we can just get rid of those incidents and near misses and fix that stuff, then statistically there will be no fatalities left to be had. It implies that by the way that the pyramid is shaped. And the BP oil spill is one example of many where it's just not true. If we are not, the things that cause fatalities and catastrophic failures in complex systems are not the same things that cause where we often focus our attention. An airplane pilot will get in trouble for walking down the jetway with a coffee cup that doesn't have a lid on it. And that'll be considered a big offense. If we can just focus on cleaning up those little things, then we're not going to have any plane crashes. And it's just not true. So I would say the research and the studies, initially, there was a belief, that we just needed to focus only on the little things, and that would prevent the big things. And I would say that the more complex the environment in which you're operating, the less true that is. So I hope that addresses that question. And there's some other observations here about some of those complex variables. Thanks, this is great. I don't always do the best job of monitoring the chat while I'm talking. So if something comes in that I should really pay attention to, please feel free to unmute and speak up, and I'll try to address that. I'm going to keep going. So I hope this little dive into accident causation was helpful, because here's the real point of all this. And I need to move my screen a little bit. The main point I'm making with these theories about accident causation is the more linear, at the linear side of the scale we are, the more simple we think about accidents, and we look for simple solutions. And the more systems approach we can take, the more we look for complex solutions. Simple often looks like blaming. Complex often looks like learning. And simple looks like find that broken domino and fix it. Find the one person that made a mistake and correct them or shame them, or kick them out of the branch. As opposed to the more systems-based we can look at it, the more we can understand what did that person see that made sense to them at the time. How was that mistake or that incident or that near miss possible because of the conditions that we created as an organization that put them in that situation, gave them that equipment, led them to leave the trailhead at the time that they did, gave them the group that they had that contributed to some of the dynamics. There's a lot upstream. And if all we do is take a linear look at the stuff, then we can take a simple view, we can blame and try to think that we fixed it, when in fact, what we really should be doing is looking at it in more complex ways, seeking to learn and understanding like what caused this to happen and what's going to keep it from happening again is a very different question than looking back and saying, whose fault was it, right? So that's the theory side. It was a little academic. I hope that was interesting, probably more so for some than others, but I think that's fascinating stuff to look at the differences between how we think about what causes an accident and how does that influence the way that we look back on it afterwards and either learn from it or not. So why in the world is my talk set up like this iceberg? An iceberg is a wonderful metaphor for me because there's a part of it that we see above the surface and a lot of it underground, underwater that we don't see. And I would suggest that what we tend to see is, and someone mentioned this in the chat earlier, you know, we tend to see the big dramatic events. We tend to see, you know, the critical incidents with injuries or fatalities, and they get a lot of our attention, and it's understandable that they do and that they should. But there's a lot going on underneath the surface, these subtleties, these near misses, these complexities, these opportunities, and they are blind spots for us. And the more we can push this iceberg up out of the water and expose more of it, the more data, the more information, the more opportunity we have to learn. So I'm going to zoom into this really cool chart right here. I'm going to give you a moment to look at that. So the graph shows, you know, imagine 100 trips that are going out or 100 classes that are being taught at the Mountaineers with the planned outcome in the middle. And some go really, really well and have these positive surprises. And a very small number have these unwanted outcomes or an injury or critical incident of some sort that occurs. And, you know, the traditional approach to safety and Heinrich's stuff that I showed you earlier often focuses just on that small little red portion at the bottom left-hand corner. And it sets as our goal preventing that. And when those things occur, we diligently, you know, tune into them and we write reports and we learn from them. And we give a lot of our time and energy to those little pieces that go wrong. And that's understandable. But what about the parts that go right? What about all the stuff that we're doing well, that we're not looking at, that we're not studying? We don't understand necessarily why. Were we smart or were we just lucky? Yeah, so I would suggest that near misses sit somewhere over in that left side, not in the red, but close. And that they are sort of our gateway into starting to understand the difference between things going wrong and this much bigger body of data, this much bigger pool of information that we could harvest by trying to understand why do things go right. Do we have as a safety goal the avoidance of bad stuff, or could it be the presence of good stuff? Could it be that we want to pursue all of this information on the right side of the screen and better understand what are we doing that are making things go so well, and debriefing, yeah, what's working instead of just focusing on avoiding what's going wrong. Someone, I saw a talk just the other day that was focusing on this, and they said that we cannot, we cannot understand happy marriage by only studying divorce. In the same way, we cannot understand, you know, having a pursuit of safety by only studying the times when things go wrong. So I really like this graph, and for me, it visually represents a shift in thinking and a paradigm change, but also, you know, where do near misses specifically sit in that paradigm?
Steve, can you leave that graph up for just 1 second? So this looks like something that, and maybe this is already collected, but that the Mountaineers could have data on just to understand if this kind of culture of valuing near misses is there, because I know we collect safety data. If the majority of it is in the left, you know, tail of that bell curve, then and there is not a large kind of quantity of near misses being reported, you really have to ask, is this
Mhm.
an intellectual exercise, or does the culture, does the culture of these activities really value reporting some of these? And if not, outside of just leader awareness,
Mhm.
what can we do to change that culture?
Yeah, Brad, that's a really astute observation. And actually the Mountaineers is better than many organizations at having, you know, a culture of reporting, I would say, a database to do a system in place, a desire to aggregate and learn from that data, and you've got a lot of the mechanism in place, but probably not as much of this mindset where you're also trying to understand why do things go right. When critical incidents occur, I've seen, a very, strong efforts to study those and to promote learning and to have change come as a result of that. But that's still living in this tiny little red part, on the left side, and it's not looking out bigger into why do most of the courses and programs go well? What can we do more of? Can we pursue some of that positive stuff and not just go away from the bad stuff? So I do think you've got rich data and an opportunity to look in it with the different methodology or with some different lenses. We're going to come back to the Mountaineers specific reporting system kind of a little bit later, but that's a very astute observation. Everybody good to move on? So we've talked about the definitions, the psychology behind it, the barriers and the theory and the iceberg. So what's next? We were going to invite you to get into some breakout rooms and have a discussion, much like Brad, beautifully just initiated. What are some things that you see that you can do personally, whatever your role may be at the organization? What can you personally do? How can you promote an environment of learning from near misses on your courses and your classes and your trips that you're leading? And then maybe third layer is as an organization, and that's kind of where Brad was going. Like, what can the organization do? What do you need from the Mountaineers in order to embrace this and better harvest, some of the opportunities that we have? There's no right or wrong answers. We really genuinely would just love for everyone to participate, and for chatting in your small groups and for coming back, even more importantly. I bet you all had very different conversations, but it'd be very nice to take a few minutes and try to hear from as many groups as we can. Just a couple of the key things, nuggets that you want to share. After we do that, I'm going to present a few more concepts, and then we're going to open it up for like a big group kind of just question and answer and discussion. So let's try not to do too many like question and answers here. I really more just want to have report outs. What were some key things that you all talked about in your group that are examples of you personally or as a trip leader or as an organization? How can we get better at learning from near misses? Whoever wants to go, we'll just open it up and hear from a handful of people. Don't be shy.
All right, I'll start off briefly. I was with Steve and Barry, who are both safety officers in their respective branches. Just a hike and trail run leader. I think one of the things that we talked about that could be helpful is just the idea of calling the reporting structure an incident report in and of itself has a negative connotation, and it kind of lumps it in with, death and broken legs and what have you. And we talked about rebranding that potentially to something else, so that it I think one of the others said kind of lowers the barrier to entry, which I think is a great term, so that people are kind of more motivated and realizes the culture of actually wanting to hear these. And then another great suggestion that I think Steve made was having some part of the incident report that also discusses what went right, or good actions that were taken that can also be highlighted, so that the whole tone of the report, even if the intention isn't to assign blame, sometimes it can feel that way to the person filling it out, just by nature of the way the report is set up.
Those are really great observations, Brad, and also like good specific solutions. I like that idea of saying what went right, and maybe even like what was learned, or like some positive things like that we can add. So great way to start. Tough act to follow, but who would like to share something that your group talked about?
I'll go. It would help people share near misses for the education of everyone and not just the participants if the definitions of what is considered a near miss and worth reporting to the organization at large would be helpful. And just to continue for the Mountaineers to continue to foster the culture of being able to report near misses to help prevent future accidents. Just like this class, and being able to provide a format without negative repercussions is helpful. So
wonderful, great ideas. I think defining it is key, because if you don't define it, that's why I spent so much time on that at the start of this talk, is because if we don't define it, we're all talking about different things to begin with. And then what can you do to foster and promote and positively reinforce? So great contributions, and Glenn, thank you. Let's hear from a few more people.
Hey, Steve, this is Tony Tsuboy. I'm going to jump on board Anne's comments there. I think she really nailed it on the head. At least from our discussion in my group, the central theme was creating the environment where we feel comfortable sharing, being vulnerable, so that we can share something that's valuable and that we can learn from. That was the nuts, and that was the nut of, I think, our discussion. There were a couple of examples. I'm looking back to this. One was a turnaround example, but creating a purposeful, opportunity for reflection, a chance to debrief, making that happen. I don't think we always do. I don't think that's quite, do not think that is quite in our culture yet, where that is expected. At the end of a trip, we're going to stop and pause and look back on what happened, and either what went well or what could we do differently, or if something happened, what are your thoughts about that afterwards? It's all too easy to just kind of have a beer at the cars and then pack up and go and really not touch on some of this touchy-feely stuff. But making that happen, I think, is really important. That was really good. I'm going to stop there because I want other people to share, but that was kind of the nuts of it.
Wonderful contributions. Absolutely agree, 100%. And just having it be normalized to have a debrief, and just a little bit of time, as opposed to that being such a shift, or people to get to a place where people actually expect that. And hey, we didn't debrief. I think that would be a wonderful thing to work towards. So great ideas, Tony. Thanks for sharing those.
I'd like to ask a question if I could.
Sure.
I think we have some safety officers on this program. I would like to know, when we send in these incident reports, does anybody organize them into categories and then list them as to which ones have the most reporting occasions, so we know which of the things are most likely to occur? It seems like all this goes into a black hole and I don't see any result from it. Maybe there is something being done that I'm not aware of, but if anybody could comment about that, I would appreciate it.
So I'll go ahead and reply. My name is Tony Tsuboy. I am the outgoing chair of the safety committee. The last 2 years, what you're asking for is kind of our year-end roll up and analysis. What did we learn from this? What are we sharing out as learnings? And I, in a lot of ways, feel like I've failed, because these last 2 years we have not produced an annual safety report. Many years going, I think we have produced that. It's been a 100-page report, verbatim, word for word. An awful lot of drill. Not something that was succinct in clarifying what did we learn from what happened. I think that's a real opportunity for us to roll up all of the incidents that get reported. There's somewhere between 150 and 200 incident reports that are produced annually, that can lead to a 100-page report that nobody's going to read. And we've produced that in the past. I think there's an opportunity for us to distill down what those incidents are and what the real learnings are. And I'm going to leave that to my successor, Bill Ashby, maybe to produce. There are some mechanical reasons why it's just been troublesome to actually spit out and produce this. And my apologies for actually not producing that product that we were on the hook to produce.
I want to give some props to Tony, though, Dick, because Tony has done an amazing job of really trying to deal with the challenge of reporting. We're trying to lower the barriers, but still have labels that fit. And it's a Herculean effort. There is data out there, and trying to figure out the best way to disseminate it. And those reports have been, highlighted in Mountaineers magazines and in trip reports. So, there's a lot that's being done, particularly if you're active on the website or reading the Mountaineer magazine. So, Tony, my hat's off to you. You've done an amazing job.
Cool. Thank you, Dan. Dick, to kind of close the loop on this, for everybody in the audience, I want to reassure you, there's a dozen or so dedicated volunteers that receive every single incident report that's submitted. The norm that we're trying to create is the applicable accountable safety officer who's responsible for that area that generated this report should be replying back to you, at least at a minimum, acknowledging, yes, we're out there, we're listening to this. We're gonna take this in and just reinforce that there's some trust in the system, and to give you some confidence that there's a reason for you reporting something that happened, whether that's a near miss or an incident that occurred. We at a minimum want to reassure you to keep doing that. We're trying to build the culture where it is the norm to report these things, and we're trying to achieve a point where there's clear expectations around what an incident is and near miss is, and when and how to report that. I don't think we're quite there. It's a long journey. We started this 10, 15 years ago, and we have some opportunities opportunities really to close that gap, but we're trying to get there. Anyways, thank you for raising the point. I think it's really good feedback.
One thing I'll mention that I've seen other organizations do is publish their summary in, like for us, the equivalent would be the Mountaineers magazine, which I have seen be very successful in disseminating that information. And the magazine format sort of necessitates short form.
Mm-hmm.
I think the vision is for us to arrive at a digest, a dozen or so stories that were actually relevant, that had concrete, stories that demonstrated here is what we learned. So often out of that 100, 150, 200 incident reports that get reported, it's I stubbed my toe and, we pulled out the first aid kit and there wasn't a lot more beyond that. That is not actionable information. However, Mike and our group just had a great example of, there was somebody who voiced they were not so comfortable on kind of an exposed, I don't know if it was a traverse, but there was a point where somebody didn't feel comfortable and they raised their hand and they said, hey, I'm not so comfortable about that. And the parties leading put in some protection. And sure enough, somebody slipped or fell, or something happened. And if it weren't for that, if they didn't react in the moment, they wouldn't have put in the protection, and it would have been, something of consequence. It would have been a problem. Somebody would have gotten hurt. I'm kind of losing track of the path I was going down there, but I think it's really important, again, just to build a culture where we feel comfortable saying, hey, I'm not so comfortable with what I'm doing right here. I hope, you can make me feel more comfortable by maybe putting in that piece of protection. If something does go wrong, then at least, we raise the bar and made it a safer environment. And if I didn't feel comfortable raising my hand saying that, then maybe something really bad could have happened.
This is absolutely super good discussion. And I have a few more points I want to move us through, and then maybe we can wrap up at the end with a little more open discussion, if that works for everyone. But thanks so much for going into those breakout rooms and coming back with such insightful observations. If we're okay to move on, I'm gonna make a few more points here. I want to share a couple things that I think we can do to help us individually and organizationally get better. So there are personal habits, there's things on social media, and then there's using some platforms. So some personal habits, and you talked about some of these just now. I would suggest exploring those assumptions that you have about accident causation. The simpler the model you're using, the easier it is to just arrive at a simple answer and to fail to harvest the deeper stories, that are out there. The daily debrief every time after every trip. And here's an example, the template that ARI uses for their avalanche education to look back after a trip has ended. But the idea of having some sort of a template or a standard questions or a structure where you create organizational norms and routines and culture around debriefing and learning and identifying those near misses, I do think it is super important to learn and not blame. It's easy to say, we want to make a culture that's open and learning, and we want to be open-minded and all that. But the moment where someone reports a near miss and then they get demoted, they get talked about behind their back, they're not allowed to lead the trip next year, the moment that there's consequences for doing your job and reporting something that didn't happen, but almost happened, is where you really start to erode people's confidence in the system itself. And I think it's incredibly easy for me to say and hard to achieve, but it is important that you do this in the spirit of learning, not blaming. And you actually can't do both. You can't blame and learn at the same time. Blaming is short-circuiting learning. It's looking back and picking out that one domino and saying, here's the problem. And there's a lot more to the story. And then, being courageous and sharing your stories and being vulnerable. And, these things all kind of work together, right? So those are some personal habits, some things on social media. Again, easy to say and hard to do. Social media is infamously bad as a platform for this, but is it possible for us to create some sort of a space, a safe space at the Mountaineers or elsewhere where there is an opportunity for people to openly share things that occurred to them without being immediately judged, blamed, attacked, villainized, demoted? I think that's incredibly important, and the way that social media often works lends itself to other approaches. But I think that this is an opportunity to use the good part, the power of social media, and without having the bad part. So that's an idea. Another one is to use existing platforms that we do have. Your incident reporting system, some of you recognize this font, and this is a screenshot from the Mountaineers website. And it talks about, do report even seemingly minor near misses. If you have doubts, send us a report. It might help someone else prevent having that same incident. So, you've got many of the principles that we've talked about here already on your website, but it's a matter of getting it more into the drinking water of the organization and really taking that next step with it. Another one is this great podcast, The Sharp End, that my friend Ashley produces. And I have an episode which is about my fall into that waterfall on Asgard Pass, if you're interested in hearing more about that story. But The Sharp End is a great example of utilizing some existing tools to learn from others. And there's something called the Alpine Near Miss Survey, which is a effort that Petzl put together some years ago, and they compiled many near misses, including some of my own, from around the country. And you can go on there and read about some of those. So I think there's existing tools out there that you can also tap into and model some of your efforts after. So those are some ideas. And I will say that if you take a concerted approach and you take an organization-wide intentional approach using some of these things that you talked about and that Tony mentioned, you can have profound success with increasing your near miss reports. And I'm going to show you an example. I was hired to work at an organization back in 2011. And when I came that very first year, this was a nationwide program that ran in all 50 states. And I was their newly hired safety guy, safety director. And the year I was hired, there were 16 near miss reports. And I knew that there were hundreds of incidents that were happening and only 16 near misses in the 50 states. And I knew that it was a year-round program, thousands of kids in the field. I knew that this was just like this tip of the iceberg, right? So I went on a campaign to educate and to stop blaming and start learning, and to train to this and to positively reinforce the near misses and all this stuff. And you can see the numbers just grow over the years. And in my final year that I was in that job, I was super proud that we had 168 near misses, and it was still not nearly enough. It was still a lot of blind spots, but it had magnified by 10 times from that first year. And I was just proud of that. And I think it's a success story, not for me, but more for like, what can an organization do if you take a concerted approach? And you could look at this and say, what's going wrong here? There's something terrible happening at this organization. Look at all these near misses that they're having. What's that Smith guy doing wrong? It's just the opposite. These were things that were happening all along, but they just weren't being reported. There was no chance to learn from them. There was no data we were gathering as a result. And it was a huge blind spot. So I was super proud of this, even if it did, some of the board members had questions. So that's a little success story there for you. And kind of just moving into a wrap-up phase here. I want to come back to Sarah's quote and see if you read it any differently now. So we operate in a wicked learning environment, which means that death can be hiding in success and complexities and massive consequences to the simplest of things. And we don't get feedback every time that we go out. We can get away with stuff and not realize the chances we have to improve. So I love this quote. And I think that it's actually up to us if we get feedback every time that we go out. And we need to create tools and systems and strategies and cultural norms so that we do get feedback every time that we go out. And that's up to you. So I hope that's a useful quote and maybe resonates a little differently at the end of the talk than it did at the beginning. So in wrapping up, I think rather than doing that final Jamboard, Sarah, I think I want to just open up the floor maybe and see what people want to talk about. We have just a few minutes left, but I'd love to hear just any kind of general comments, questions, something you wanted to ask earlier. If you'd like to connect with me personally, you can find me. There's my email, and you can find me on these various social media sites. And I'd be happy to continue this conversation with any of you. But let's hear a few just kind of wrap up comments, questions. What would people like to say or ask about that you haven't had a chance to explore yet?
I was just curious, do you know, Steve, like there's an accident report every year issued by the AAC, but most of the accidents I read about in the news, I check for those the year later and they're not in that report, right? Mm-hmm. Do you know like what percentage of accidents probably get reported to the AAC?
It's sort of an impossible one to answer because, you know, we can't measure what isn't reported so much, but I'd say it's all vastly underreported. You know, the things that make the news are the ones that are deemed newsworthy. It's that iceberg thing again. You know, we really hear just about the tip of that iceberg. When I came to the Mountaineers some years ago, there was actually a standing policy not to report any of the Mountaineers incidents to the American Alpine Club for that periodical. And I believe, you know, we challenged that a little bit. And I'm not sure if they're being reported now or not. But, you know, I think generally those barriers that we mentioned earlier are appreciable, and it's hard for people to break through those and to report things and share them. And I think we have this larger moral responsibility as a club and as an industry to get better at that, you know, and to really start doing a better job of sharing our lessons learned so that others don't have to repeat those same mistakes, you know. And it's a free lesson, you know. There's no lawsuit for an accident that doesn't happen, but there is learning. You know, so I really think that's why near misses are the key, because like if you can do that well with near misses, it opens up the opportunity to do it with other things too.
Cool. Yeah, I was surprised because some of the incidents were actually, like in Yosemite last year, there's a park ranger who actually goofed his rappel and died. Mm-hmm. And it never showed up in an accident report for the past 2 years.
Wow.
So it seems like organizations don't even have a policy about it.
A lot of organizations have like a legal counsel, you know, that has advised them to be, you know, fearful of you know, liability, and to, you know, carefully cover and protect things, you know, for PR reasons. And there are situations where that may be valid and recommended. And, you know, if there is a lawsuit, or there are situations where I'd say it's case by case, but generally speaking, you know, most things are very reportable and shareable and learnable, and they just don't because of those barriers that we talked about. So, you know, generally speaking, I would say it's low-hanging fruit. And again, the near misses is like easy, right? That's an easy one.
Yeah, I'd say another barrier to reporting is simply ease of reporting. You know, looking on the Mountaineers website and trying to find the critical incident form in and of itself was a bit of an effort just now. And although I personally haven't seen the incident report form, Ed is the Mountaineer. I am the add-on to this event. I am guessing that it's probably a lot of qualitative data, which can be really difficult to synthesize and summarize succinctly. So revising how you capture data can really help you roll that data up into meaningful ways by making it more accessible. You know, SurveyMonkey is a super easy free tool that if you blast your climb group after a climb with a really simple, less than 5 minute SurveyMonkey survey that just captures general sentiment about safety of the climb and allows for follow-up, that can take you 80% of the way there on those annual safety reports. And then you deep dive on specific cases to get to those case studies that you guys publish.
It's a very good practical suggestion. And, you know, one of the things I've seen is, and this is not necessarily about the Mountaineers, but generally in the work that I do, working with lots of organizations, you know, the incident report form will be designed for the very worst case scenario. And it'll have pages and pages and pages of things that need to be filled out, which would be useful if there was a fatality, but it's not at all useful if you just want to have a quick, like 2-minute, hey, this thing almost happened, here's what we learned, here's what was involved, call me if you have any questions. You know, the more you can make the near miss and minor incident reporting simple, the more of them you're going to hear about. And someone you can follow up with to get more of that other information if needed. So kind of like a tiered level of complexity, but the form itself and the reporting process itself for many organizations is like the biggest barrier. So that doesn't help.
Too, and that is where I come from. You end up shooting yourself in the foot because the lawyers get involved. They want documentation at a legal level, but you need to find the happy medium. And I know this is, you know, a challenge for any organization, particularly volunteer organizations,
Sure.
to find that opportunity to get the data that the lawyers need to, you know, protect the institution, but also get the data that the institution needs to continue to improve.
Mhm. Yeah, there's HR laws, you know, there's different factors. There's things around confidentiality. I mean, there are pressures and challenges that make what I'm saying, you know, easy to say and sometimes hard to do, but I really think it's surmountable. And you know, that chart that I showed was a good example of how you can battle back and really increase. What you want to see is your near misses increase, but not your actual incidents increase, right? So you want to pump up the near misses and hopefully manage, you know, the critical things as best you can. What else? Other comments? We're kind of a little bit over, but I'd love to, if there's any burning questions or comments, I'd love to take them. Well, I am available if anyone wants to email me any questions or anything like that. I'll just say thank you. What an engaged and excellent set of comments and questions. And I really appreciate you all taking, you know, time on a Wednesday night to talk about this academic stuff. And I think that, you know, the club will be moving in a great direction with many of the suggestions that you all had and your energy. And if you can remember that it's really about looking into the future and not looking into the past. It's about how can we keep this from happening again, not who can we blame and shame and, you know, make them regret that they ever reported this thing to begin with. If we can get to that place, I think you're going generally in a good direction. And Sarah, I believe we might do this same talk again in a few months. So if you thought this was valuable and you want to, you know, send other people from your branch to participate, I'd be happy to see them there. So I guess I'll just wrap things up and turn it back over to you, Sarah. And thanks so much, everyone, for a great discussion.
Thanks, Steve. And thank you all for joining this evening. I think the only thing I'll add is we talked a lot about the mechanics of incident reporting at the Mountaineers tonight. And if you have any follow-up questions or thoughts that you want to discuss, just know that staff's always available to have those conversations, and our safety committee as well is a great resource for those conversations. So Tony mentioned that he's outgoing. Thanks, Tony, for all of your hard work as our safety committee chair for the last couple of years. So he's still around, and Bill Ashby is coming in as our new safety chair. So if you need help connecting with those folks, I'm happy to help do that, or I'm happy to discuss if there's any questions. So we've got our contact info, and please do reach out.